Welcome to the Bootstrap 5 course. In this video, you will learn how to build responsive websites quickly with Bootstrap 5. So this is the Bootstrap website. They recently changed it and I think it looks really nice, very modern. Because Bootstrap was getting a bit of an outdated or old-fashioned type of reputation because front-end web development has changed a lot in the past few years. We have React now and you write CSS in React a little bit differently. We have Tailwind and CSS itself has also changed with Flexbox and CSS Grid. But it looks great and modern and I like using Bootstrap for this project in the course too, because it's very easy to use and their components also have a modern look now. And from looking around, it's very popular among its users, so I'm confident that there will be a popular library for a very long time. The project of this course is this one. It's using the Bootstrap components. We will talk about what that means, but those are things like the button, the navbar, the carousel, the modal, the form in the modal, the accordion component, but it's also using the famous grid system of Bootstrap and the utility classes. It's also responsive and everything else that you need to know about Bootstrap is in here. So before we jump into the project, I quickly want to give you an overview of the most powerful features of Bootstrap. So first of all, when you include Bootstrap in your project, you get access to built-in components. So you don't have to create, for example, a whole button from scratch in HTML and CSS yourself. You only have to use one of the Bootstrap classes like BTN and then one of the theme classes like BTN primary, and you will get a complete button, including hover and focus states. And a button is still a pretty simple, small component, but you also get access to more complicated components like a responsive navbar and carousel and modals and an accordion component and even complete forms, including with cool effects like floating labels. Right, so these are all components that you get out of the box. Now, if these components are not enough, there are also third-party UI kits out there that you can use, and they also adhere to the Bootstrap philosophy of the grid and things like that. So you can easily integrate them in your own Bootstrap project. Now, it also has a lot of so-called utility classes. So these classes are used for, one-off, quick type of styles. So for example, you want to set a font size for a particular element, for example, the heading or some text. Now you don't set a font size like CSS, right? Font size 50 pixels or something like that. So you set a font size by picking one of the options that you get. So there are like 5 or 6 different options for the font size. And one of the benefits of these options is that it forces consistency, because you don't want to have random font sizes all over your project. You do want to have some kind of consistency, right? But there are other utility classes as well. All right, so another powerful feature is the container class, because often what happens on your websites is that if you have a header, for example, the content will sit right against the edge of the viewport. And we don't want that. We want there to be some padding. Right, we want there to be some space between the viewport edge and the content, and it's not only the header; it's also the hero section or other content parts of your website. So Bootstrap has a container class which very nicely and responsively constrains the width and also centers the content immediately. Right, it's just one class, and boom, a lot of problems have been solved. So this is very powerful. We'll see how this works in the project as well. All right, now Bootstrap is also sort of famous for its grid system. So the grid system, very briefly, you can create a div and this is going to be a row. So this is how it starts. You create a row and then in that row, you basically have 12 units to allocate. That's how it works, right? So for example, maybe you want 2 columns, right? So you have a row and the units then go to those columns. So maybe we want 2 columns that are equally wide. So we can both give them 6 units out of the 12, right? So then you can put anything in there and that will take up, half the space, right? And you can fine tune it. Maybe one column needs to be 4 units and the other a little bit bigger, 8 units, right? So now you get a different allocation. It's going to look slightly different. That's the grid system in a nutshell. We'll see how it works in practice. Also, Bootstrap is responsive pretty much out of the box. So all of those components that we've seen, the navbar, the carousel, the modal, the accordion, those are all responsive out of the box. And the utility classes like margins and font size and padding, you can also change them depending on the viewport width, right? Or breakpoints, right? So for example, on smaller viewports, right? Let's say mobile phones, we don't want to have so much vertical space. So I want to decrease the vertical space on smaller devices and then on bigger devices, let's say tablet and upwards, there should be more vertical space. I think that looks better. I think it's more suitable. So that's very easy to do because with Bootstrap, you get these suffixes that you can add. So MD, for example, or LG, those all stand for a particular breakpoint. So you can use all of these utility classes. You can slightly change them to really fine tune it depending on the width of the device that you're trying to target. And it's a mobile first philosophy, by the way, right? So the default, if you just use some utility class for a margin or padding, for example, without any of those breakpoints in the class, that's going to be for mobile. And then what you can do is from a particular breakpoint and onwards, right? And bigger, you can change it, for example, right? We'll talk much more about that. And also the typography automatically scales down or up depending on how wide the viewport is, right? So on smaller devices, it's automatically going to be slightly smaller. And on bigger devices, it's a little bit bigger. Now, I will say Bootstrap is most useful if you already know CSS itself. In fact, I highly recommend that you master CSS itself because it doesn't take that long and it helps you immensely as a front-end web developer. So check out my professional CSS course. The link is in the description. Also because Bootstrap does not cover 100% of the things that you want to do. So often you do need to write some custom CSS yourself. So make sure that you have learned CSS itself properly. All right, so the link is in the description. There are some other things that I quickly want to explain to you. So in my code editor here, if I type some classes here, I get these suggestions. You do not get them out of the box in Visual Studio Code. So you need to install an extension if you want them. So the extension is called HTML CSS. What this extension can do, you can see it's very popular, but what it can do is it can see what you're linking to in your HTML. So it can see the style sheet that you're importing, and it can see in the style sheet what kind of classes there are available, right? So then it can suggest them. Okay, now secondly, how to include Bootstrap in your project. So we will go through this, of course, but just to quickly show you, there are two options. So option one is with NPM and Node.js, and this will give you more fine-grained control because you get access to the actual source code of Bootstrap. So for example, if you use BTN or BTN primary, that will give you a blue color. If you don't want to get a blue color for BTN primary, you have to go into the source code, and they use SAS for that, which by the way is also taught in my professional CSS course. But if you want to change the primary color from blue to a different color, you have to do it like that, right? So you have to go into the settings, into the source code and configure it differently. Now, of course, that's more cumbersome to set up, but you do get more fine-grained control. Now, second option is a little bit easier, but you don't get the source code, you get the build code, and we can actually see what you get if you copy the link here and open it up in a new tab, right? So this is the actual style sheet that we can simply link to with a link element in our HTML, right? So the browser will make a network request to this address, and this is what we will get back. And don't worry, we'll see how this works very easy. It's just like linking to your own custom style sheet, and this is what we get back. And in here you can see there are some classes, right? So it's almost not legible here because this is the optimized code. Right, the source code is in SAS and you have to do it with NPM. This is already the optimized, the build code. So it's going to be minified and things like that, right? So here you can see there's a certain class, and then you can see what this selector, I should say, you can see what this rule set applies. Okay, now some components need JavaScript as well. For example, the accordion component, right here we can click and it does something, right? So Bootstrap needs to get access to the click event with JavaScript and then do something. So there is also a JavaScript portion of Bootstrap. So that's also what we're going to link to because we're going to use some of those components that need JavaScript. Okay, now Bootstrap also has icons. You don't have to use these icons. There are also other options, but these icons work well with Bootstrap. So you'll see how we can include that and how it works. And that's a quick overview of Bootstrap. Now, the best way to actually learn Bootstrap is to continue watching this video because I will build a project from scratch here. So you can see how all of this works in practice. So try to make it all the way to the end. You walk away with much more clarity. So let's jump into it. All right, so now I'm gonna quickly create a complete website or page from scratch using Bootstrap. And it looks like this. So we have a navbar at the top, right? That's a out-of-the-box component that you get with Bootstrap. Then we have this carousel slider,
If you click on one of these buttons, we actually get a modal component from Bootstrap with a form in there. The form looks pretty cool because we have like a floating label. That's very easy to do with Bootstrap. And then we have this section over here with a particular layout. We have the packages section with cards. These cards also come from Bootstrap. And then we have the accordion component from Bootstrap here in the frequently asked questions, right? And then we have a simple footer, right? So this project, I will quickly show you how to build this. It uses some of the components that you get from Bootstrap, some common components like buttons, but also bigger ones like navbar and carousel. It uses the grid system, right? So that's a very important part of Bootstrap. It also has responsiveness built in, right? So you can see everything adapt to the viewport. That's very easy to do with Bootstrap. A lot of components are simply responsive out of the box. It's using the utility classes that you get from Bootstrap, right? So to change the font size, for example, or to add padding and things like that, right? So we'll see how everything works, and I'll do it pretty quickly. Okay, so I have opened up my code editor here, and I have opened a folder here. That's how it works with Visual Studio Code. So the first file I'm going to create is an HTML file. Every website, no matter how complicated, starts with HTML. And here I can type HTML, and if I pick the second suggestion here, I get a boilerplate. So we'll change this in a second. I'm also going to create my own custom style sheet, because the thing with Bootstrap is it doesn't cover 100% of the things that you want to do. So sometimes you need to write your own custom styles. That's why it's super important that you have mastered CSS itself, right? So you need to know Flexbox, animations and transitions, for example. All these things, you have to learn them, you know, in plain CSS first, in my opinion. And then you can learn an abstraction like Bootstrap. And learning the abstraction will be very easy because you know how things work under the hood, right? So make sure you check out my professional CSS course. The link is in the description, right? So now in HTML, we do need to link to this style sheet here. Otherwise the browser won't know that it exists. Okay, I'm gonna call this something like Aurora Tours, right? We can imagine this is a fictional company offering tours to where you can see auroras. Not sure how to pronounce that. Right, so Aurora Tours, travel with us. I'm gonna right click here and open it with Live Server. This is an extension in Visual Studio Code, and it will make sure that whenever you make a change in the HTML or CSS, then it automatically updates the page so that you don't have to refresh all the time. Okay, so now we have an empty page. Let's see. So I want to start with Bootstrap. Now, before we can even start that, we need to make sure that it's actually included in our HTML. I'm going to close the sidebar here. So you can go to the Bootstrap website. You can search for Bootstrap or Bootstrap docs. Now, when you do this, you have to be careful because there's a bunch of different links here. The first link that I'm getting here actually links to an older version, 4.1. I'm actually going to use 5.2, but here you have 5.0, for example. So that's also something that you want to pay attention to. So this is actually the website I want. It also looks different from the other versions. And here they also show you how to include it via CDN, right? So we've discussed the other way of doing it. You can change the source files like that. You can change their variables and things like that, which is not going to be necessary here. This is for the CSS. However, some components like the, Modal, for example, here, when you click on the button and you open the Modal, the accordion component, they have, right, they react to clicks. So Bootstrap needs to be able to access the click event with JavaScript and then do something. So we need to include JavaScript here as well. Now, when you include JavaScript, you can do it at the end of the body, or you can do it in the head these days. But when you do it like this, you do have to include the defer attribute for, that's simply optimal. So be careful with just putting a script in here, linking to an external script, because it will block parsing the rest of the page, except if you include defer here. Right, so now we have both parts of Bootstrap. Now, very quickly, you may be wondering, why do we have this weird integrity? Well, this integrity is basically a hash of what the content should be, right? So the browser is going to make a network request to get this style sheet here, right? But this server may be hacked. And when the browser, tries to get the content there, it may send something malicious back, right? So here with this integrity attribute, the browser will only apply it if this is a hash, if the hash of what we get back is the same as this hash, right? A little bit complicated, but it's basically a security mechanism. Same goes for cross origins, also for security. We don't want to send any cookies or like identifiers to that server when we make that request, right? That's what that means. Not really important. Most developers don't know what it is, so don't worry. But maybe you were wondering about that. Okay, so now we have Bootstrap installed. I want to start from the top here, right? So now we get to this part here, and this is actually a so-called navbar component in Bootstrap. So with these bigger components, I do not recommend trying to code them from scratch yourself, because there's too many classes to remember. And let me actually make it a little bit smaller. Right, so what you can do is you can simply go to the docs, make sure you get the right version, and then here we have all the components that you get out of the box. Right, so we have more simple ones like buttons. Right, this button is going to be pretty easy to code from just by memory, because there's only a couple of classes that you have to memorize. However, with a carousel, for example, or a navbar or modal, there's just too many things going on basically. So you do want to just go to the docs and you can read up on it, but usually it's enough to just copy their examples and then modify it as you see fit, right? So here you can see we have nav, right? This is an example they show, and there's a navbar class, navbar expand, navbar brand, navbar toggler, right? Don't code this from scratch. Just copy one of their examples and customize it to get what you want. So that's what I will do here. So let's take a look. Yeah, so this looks like what we want. Of course, the layout is not the same, but we'll change that in a second. So I'm gonna copy this example, and then I'm gonna paste it right here. Okay. So if I save that, let's see what we get. Okay, so then we have this. So we don't have the right color here. So let's see. So here they call it BG light. Now we actually want BG dark. This is actually a utility class, meaning this BG dark is not something that you only see with this component. You can use it anywhere where you want a background color. Right, let's see if I can quickly show that. We'll talk more about utilities. Oh yeah, so here we have utilities for the background, right? And they have some out of the box. We're using BG dark. Right, so whenever you want to use, so whenever you need some kind of background, you don't have to create a class and then select it and then background color, right? You can just use one of those out of the box classes and it will immediately apply it. Now we want the text in here actually to be light. So what you can actually do is you can use a theme class for this navbar. If we say that this is a dark navbar, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but it will actually make the text light because, well, the navbar has a dark theme and therefore there's going to be dark colors in the background and therefore the text needs to be white. Now also, we don't want this navbar, well, what is this actually? This is the brand. So let's actually change this to our brand, Aurora Tours. We don't want this to sit against the edge or so close, right? So here there's more space. Also here on the other side, we'll change the layout in a second, there's more space. When you deal with that stuff against the edge of the viewport, you're working with the so-called container class in Bootstrap. This is a very handy class. Let me show you what they mention about that. Yeah, so for layout containers, yeah, so here the two common ones are, for example, container fluid, which is what we have now. So it's right. So this container fluid, and let me actually add some space so we can easily distinguish all of the different subcomponents here. So this container fluid is holding the navbar brand and then also the links. And here we can see that means it's going to be 100% width on all viewports. So no matter how wide it gets, it always stays against the edge here basically, which is not what we want. So there's another class, simply container, and you can see here that on various viewports is that the size of that container also changes. So for example, the container class, so that's the first row here, is going to be, well, on very small devices, on mobile phones, 100% width, which is what we want. But on very large devices, it's going to be constrained. It's only going to be 1320 pixels. So I'm going to change this to simply container, which will constrain the width more, as you can see. And also when we make it smaller, it doesn't start getting against the edge, right? So you can see that. And by the way, the navbar is actually already working. as you can see, right? So it's already working with the collapse with this hamburger menu. Now there's one problem here, of course, which is that this should sit on the other side. So let's see, we have this div which is holding those links, right? So so let's actually work on this a little bit. So we want to remove this disabled. We don't want that. We have two other links, packages and frequently asked questions. Okay, now when you copy the stuff from the examples, there's also going to be area attributes here. This has to do with accessibility, and I'll probably make a different video on this. I'm going to remove it because it may be confusing to some of you. And I want to focus on how Bootstrap actually works, but it's very nice that they include the accessibility things out of the box as well. So I'm also going to remove this, because we only have packages and frequently asked questions, right? This is what we have, and it should sit on the other side. So how can we do that? Well, it's a little bit advanced, perhaps, right? So this div here is spanning the entire width here, actually, and then we have the UL sitting in there. So we want to, what we can do here is we can add margin on the left side here, and we can use margin auto, because it's actually a flex container, right? So this is why it's important that you understand the underlying fundamentals, because sometimes, well, you need to understand Flexbox here, for example, because what you can do in a flex container like that is you can use margin auto, which will push itself all the way to the other side. So I can say margin start. So here, Bootstrap is not using margin left. It's using margin start, which is a little bit confusing, but the reason for this is that some languages, they start from the right? So you read right to left. So from their perspective, it's margin right. So we cannot say margin left, because for some languages, it's not going to be correct. So instead, you have margin start as an abstraction, margin start and margin end, right? So margin start auto, which will create as much margin as possible here, which will push it all the way here, right? So make sure you understand Flexbox. So we also want to put this in uppercase. So we can simply go to navbar brand, and we say one of the utility classes, actually. We don't have to, do it in our own style sheet. We can just use one of those classes, and it's going to be uppercase, right? So this navbar brand class, for example, it adds some padding to the text in here. It also removes that default styling that you get with an anchor tag, like the blue color and the underline. It removes that stuff. So that's why these out-of-the-box classes are handy, but you're not going to remember all of these out-of-the-box classes like navbar nav, navbar brand, navbar toggler, right? So this toggler, this button, is the actual button here. And actually, let's see. Yeah, so here, now we can talk about responsiveness, because here, it's no hamburger menu yet, but here it already is, right? So we can also change that. So the thing with Bootstrap is, when you talk about responsiveness, Bootstrap has a mobile-first philosophy. So from their perspective, you start like this, right? You don't actually have to do this, but this is simply how they have structured the Bootstrap classes and things like that. So you start from mobile first, and then you can decide at which breakpoint, right? So Bootstrap has a breakpoint, and let's see, these are the ones that you're going to use often. So let's see, breakpoints. Yeah, so these are the important breakpoints that you get in Bootstrap. So you can see we have small, medium, large. We can decide from which breakpoint onward does it need to be expanded. So we could say, for example, from medium or small, let's say small, from small and onwards, it should be expanded. So from 576 pixels of width of the viewport, right? So when this viewport is 576 pixels wide or bigger, it should be expanded. Right now, we can actually see this. It's expanding when it reaches the large breakpoint, which is 992. We're going to change this to small. Right, so you can use these suffixes like SM or LG with a lot of classes to really customize the styling based on some kind of breakpoint. Right, so now on mobile, it's still gonna be a hamburger menu, right? But then when we get to the small breakpoint, it will be expanded. That's the same as in the example. Right, so navbar already gets a little bit complicated because it's a bigger component with a little bit of a tricky part with the hamburger menu. So make sure you follow the examples, because especially as a beginner Bootstrap developer, it's going to be you know, too complicated in the beginning to do it by yourself from scratch, right? So just go to the examples and customize it as you see fit. Okay, so then let's continue with the second part, which is this. This is actually a carousel component. This is actually also a bigger component, and so whenever you have that, I recommend to just go to the documentation, and then here for components, let's see, we have carousel, and they always have examples. So you can have slides only, but we have with controls, right? Those are these things. That's what we want, but we also want with indicators. Those are those things, right? And we also want captions, because that's going to be the actual text here. So that's a lot of HTML. So I will quickly start off with their simple version here, just so we can get a little bit familiar with this very common component, and then see how we can customize it. So here we have the navbar. Now, typically an HTML document has a particular structure, right? So we have like a header and then the main part. So now we have the main, and then eventually you have a footer, right? And this is actually not a header. In Bootstrap, they call this a navbar. So I'm simply using the nav tag. Maybe you're more familiar with this as a header. I am, at least, but in Bootstrap, well, they've gone with the term navbar. So here in the main, I'm just gonna paste the carousel, and that doesn't do anything yet because we don't have those images yet. So now I'm just gonna copy the image URLs. Okay, so I have copied the image URLs, I'm saving the file here, and now this is what we get. So the problem with the carousel is that it doesn't restrain the height of the images out of the box. So here we actually need to write some custom styles, right? Because these images, or we only see one image now, but it will go to the next image in a second. These images are too big right now. So if we want to style this, we do have to look at how it's structured here, right? So you can see it move to a different image. So we have this div, this overall div, carousel, that there is a carousel inner class, right? Are you going to remember that stuff? I don't think so. Just go to the documentation and copy it and paste it. So it's basically just a bunch of different items. That's what it's going to slide between. So in the items, we have the actual image. So here we need to give the item a height. So I'm going to give it a custom class. I think that's a little bit cleaner, that we don't touch the Bootstrap classes. We just create our own class. I'm just going to call it C item. And then we also need to style the individual images. So same story. I will just use a custom class here. Right, and then we can simply select it in our own style sheet as you are maybe you're used to. Okay, so then we give the item, that's the parent element of these images. We're gonna give this a height of 480 pixels, and then we can tell the images to take up 100% of that. Right, so when we do that, this is what we get. Now, when you work with images, it's very tricky, but they have a certain aspect ratio. And when you start playing with their height and width, that can get distorted. So you get a weird distorted look. So typically what you want to do when you change the height or width of an image is you also want to say object fit cover, which will preserve that aspect ratio, right? So now you can see it looks sharp and it looks non-distorted. Now the images should be a bit darker because we're going to place text on top of it. So we can simply use filter brightness, right? This is something we have to write ourselves. This does not, there's no utility class for this, right? So again, you need to know CSS itself, and this is just one little silly thing, but there are more important things like flexbox and animations and transitions, I have to say, that you really need to know about as well. So that's those are the images, look good. So now we want to add those controls so we can switch back and forth. So you go here and you see with controls, and they add some buttons here. So actually we only have to copy this, I think. And then we have to paste it. Let's see, after carousel inner. Let me add some space here as well. Yeah, so here, this should do it, I think. Yeah, so now we have these controls. Now, if I click on them, they don't work. So let's see why not. So they are using data attributes, by the way, right? So here, this button has a data attribute. They use this because when I click on here, there is a click event, right? And then they're going to use JavaScript to do something, but they need to know which carousel, because we could technically have multiple carousels. It needs to know which carousel needs to go to the next slide. So here they use an ID for that. Yeah, so here this should be the ID. This was a different ID because it was a different example. I think it's a little bit strange that in their documentation for those two different examples, they use a different ID. That's very tricky. So make sure that if you use the carousel that you pay attention to the ID. Right, now this works. Right, so in HTML, you can create your own data attributes as these are called. So this is technically possible. And this is handy for JavaScript purposes. You don't really need to understand those specifics, but this is what Bootstrap uses under the hood, right? And then we have some ARIA things here. I'm just gonna remove this for now. Right, but those buttons here are pretty straightforward, I think. Okay, let's also quickly add the indicators. I think those always look pretty cool. Shouldn't be too hard. So here we see something with indicators in this example. So they place it above the carousel inner. And here they also use a target because again, you click on something, so it needs to know which carousel needs to be changed. Here we have the indicators. Okay, so last thing we have to do here is add the captions, and that's the text here, right? So each slide has a caption and we're gonna style it like this. You go to documentation, there's actually an overview here, or we already see it with captions. Typically it's usually smaller text at the bottom, like a small description, but I'm just gonna use it as like headings for our page. So each item, because it's connected to an item, has can have like a caption, right? So here I'm just going to copy this example here, caption. We can paste that in the item here. And let's see what we get. So then we get this caption and then we can style it. Here we actually just have a paragraph element. Then we have an H1 and then we have a button. The button is actually also a component, right? So you get these buttons out of the box. This one always looks pretty cool, I think. The blue color is fine with me, right? This is BTN and then you need to use BTN primary and then you get the button. If you want to use BTN primary, but you want a different color when you use the BTN primary class, like that's an example of when you have to go into the source code and change those settings, right? And that's in Sass, right? So here we're not going to do that, but that's a more advanced use case that you may want to use at some point. So here I'm just going to have the text. That's going to be the upper text. It's not going to be a heading. It's just, well, text, paragraph. Discover the hidden world. And then we have the Aurora tours. That's actually going to be the most important heading on the page. So I'll use an H1 for that. And then we have that button, right? I will add the classes BTN and BTN primary. Book a tour. Okay, so then we have this. So it needs to sit up here. And this is actually already so-called absolutely positioned. So what you can do with these captions is you can go here and you can use those offsets, right? So with position absolute, if you've ever used normal CSS and you've used position absolute, maybe you remember that you can use like top, bottom, right, left. We're basically saying here it should sit 0 pixels from the top, right? And there will be some space, but this is already much better. Now it needs to sit a little bit lower. So there are some classes for that as well. We can add margin on the top, right? So it's empty. And then you don't say margin top 55 pixels, but they actually have like predetermined sizes. And they do this because it basically forces consistency, right? Also with font sizes, for example, as we'll see in a second. Well, actually, let's do that. So here for this one, then we want to increase the font size. So we can say FS, and then you can use one of the numbers. So for example, FS3. And now this text is bigger. We also want this to be uppercase, right? So with these numbers, it forces consistency because we cannot have all of these random font sizes like 51 pixels and then somewhere else 28 pixels. You have basically like 5-6 different options, and yeah, it basically forces a nice consistency, which is very handy because maybe you tend to use all sorts of different values. So I'm also going to add some margin on the top. So I say margin top 5, add some more margin. Then for this H1, I want to increase it as well. So there's another class for sort of the font size. It's called display. I can also change the font weight. I can say FW, font weight, bolder, and then also capitalize, right? So all of these are utility classes, right? And then it's bigger, right? So utilities, these are just quick one-off classes, right? Usually to achieve one specific thing. And you can do all sorts of things like colors for the background, for text, there's all sorts of utilities. That's different from these other classes like carousel indicators. Right, that's a different class. It belongs to the carousel component, and these classes often need to be used in conjunction. Right, these utility classes can often be used standalone, just one, quick one-off styles. So let's continue with the button. Button needs to be a little bit bigger and more. It needs to be positioned more lower. Also, this needs to be uppercase. So let's see. We can set text uppercase, and then the button. For the button, we want to add some padding. And here we want to add padding both on the left side and on the right side. So that's px, right? So if we only want it on the left side, we use ps for padding start or padding end, right, on the right side. But if you want it on both sides, right, so we use x for the horizontal direction. And then we have one of those, you can use numbers again. So, and then for the vertical axis, we have py. So on both top and bottom, we want to add, well, py, and then you have those numbers again. You get these options basically. By the way, if you want to get these suggestions, make sure that you install the extension HTML CSS support, right? It can see what you're importing, what you're linking to in your HTML. Right, so we are linking to that Bootstrap style sheet so it knows which classes are going to be available. So here we want py2, and I will also make the font size a little bit bigger, and I will add some margin on the top. That is what we want. Okay, right, so then with these captions, we did it for one item, so now we can do it for the other items as well. I will quickly do that here. Right, so I only have to change the text here, so I will quickly do that. Okay, so I just copied the captions to the other two items and just customized the text. Every slide has a caption, right? Very easy to do with Bootstrap. If you had to do this in plain CSS, that would take much more time. Okay, now this is taking up a lot of space here in my HTML. So what you can do is you can collapse everything here. So let's see. I just want to make this carousel collapsed here in my HTML. I'll do the same for the navbar, so that we have a little bit of a better overview. Okay, so now when we click on this button, we actually want to see a modal, right? This is a modal component. It works the exact same, to be honest. So I would go here, I would go to components, and then we have modal. And you can read through it if you want, but usually it's pretty straightforward. You can just copy one of the examples and customize it as you see fit. So that's exactly what I'm going to do here. And I'm not going to show you the whole process over and over again, because there are other things that I want to show you as well, like the grid system, some of the other utility classes. So I will just quickly implement that and then we'll continue. Right, so I just copy and pasted the modal. I'm just doing it above the carousel. This is the modal, and then we can customize the modal, but let's actually see if we can open this up. So that's something that we haven't seen before. So how do we do that? So how can we open up this modal? Because if we click on the button now, it doesn't work. Well, we are working with a click event again. So usually when that's the case, you have to give something an ID. So we give the modal an ID. I will call it booking modal. And then when we click on these buttons, we want to signal to Bootstrap that this is the modal that we want to open up. So if we go to the button here, Bootstrap is using those data attributes. So here we have to add two data attributes. So it's called data BS for Bootstrap. And it's basically toggling, right? So opening and closing is toggling. So here we're specifying what needs to be toggled. Well, it needs to be the modal. And specifically, the target is the element with an ID of booking modal, right? So now I've given the first button here in this carousel those data attributes, and now it opens up, as you can see, right? Now this is not very smooth. And also doesn't work yet for the other buttons, but it's not very smooth, right? So if you want to make it smooth, we can add a class here to the modal called fade. And then it's very smooth, right? I'll quickly do it for the other buttons as well. Right, so I just added these data attributes for the other buttons as well, so I can close the carousel again. So now these other buttons work as well. All right, so now we can change the actual modal. Right, so I will just quickly customize this, but it's very straightforward, right? So instead of the title should be book a tour, the body will actually be a form. We'll do that in a second. And this should be checkout. Okay, so then we have this. Now what we want in the body is actually a form. And then we have an input here with a floating label, which means that when you make it focused, the label appears to move up here. And then we also have this select element with 3 options. So forms are very important. They actually have a whole section for themselves here, but this is also sort of, sort of like a component. It's just a bunch of classes that you tend to use together. And it's the same thing. You would go here, you would look at some of the examples, you would copy one of the examples that you sort of want, and then you can customize it. So here with forms, I will actually write it from scratch here because it's a little bit more straightforward here. So we simply have a form element, right? This is just from normal HTML. So then we have that input. So we just have an input element, and the type is actually email. The class here is going to be one of Bootstrap's, so it's going to be form control as they call it. Now we want to have that floating label, so we do need a label as well. So to connect that, we need to give this an ID of, let's say, email 1, and this can be email address. Okay. Now you need to wrap this to make this a floating, to make this float basically in the input. We can wrap this in a new element with a Bootstrap class called form floating. That's how Bootstrap does it. You wrap it in an element with a class of form floating. So then let's see. So then we have this input, but now the label is already floating here. It's always floating. So we actually need to add a placeholder. But this can be anything actually, because it's using the placeholder functionality of the browser to make that work. So it doesn't really matter what you type here, but that's necessary for how this works under the hood, right? So now we have a very cool floating effect. So then we also have that other one, that select, and it's the same story. With a select, we actually also want a floating label. So I will use the same here. Let's see, pick a tour. And now we will just have select 1. Right, I'm just adding another class called form select here, which will style this as a typical Bootstrap select element. So in a select, we have options. We have those 3 options. I will just quickly write them down. Okay, so these are the 3 options, and this is actually the form that we want, right? So now when you do that, we have an input and we have a select. So now it gets interesting, because now we want to talk about the layout here, because if we look here, they are actually sitting next to each other, right? So we can actually use the grid system in Bootstrap to work with this, also because we want to have a different layout depending on the breakpoint, depending on some breakpoint, right? So you can see here on smaller devices, we actually do want a stacked layout. And then on wider devices, we want to have a horizontal layout. So how can we do this? Well, here we can use the grid system. So the grid system, what it comes down to is you create a new element with a class of row. In the row, you basically get 12 units to allocate, right? So the entire row is going to be 12 units wide, and you can determine how many columns there should be and how many of those units they should take up. So here we're going to have, we basically want to have 2 columns. So we can say .col -6, right? So the first column is going to take up 6 of those units. And the other column is also going to take up 6 of those units, right? It needs to be in the row, right? And then we can put this first div in here, right? This will automatically take up the width that this one gets. Same goes for this one. Right, so now we have a row. In the row, you get 12 units, and we're basically we're allocating that equally to 2 columns, right? So now you can see we have, well, a row, and we have 2 columns, right? The elements in the columns will automatically take up the entire width. Now we have some default space between them. I think this is a bit much. So you can also go to row here, and you can give it a gutter or gap, or you can define how much that should be. You get a couple of options here. We want number 2, and that makes it a little bit less. So this looks pretty cool, but now the thing is, it's gonna be like this on all viewport, right? So what we actually want is this horizontal layout only on wider viewport, right? So maybe only when it has crossed a certain breakpoint. So here we could say only when it has, when it has crossed this, maybe the small breakpoint and bigger, do we want to have this horizontal layout. So what you can do is you can go to these columns and you can say it should take up 6 units when it reaches the small breakpoint. Right, and when you do that, the default is, by the way, stacked. Yeah, so this is working now. You can see that it's stacked, and then when it crosses the small breakpoint, it gets 6 units each, and we get that horizontal layout. Now, I was a little bit confused because here in the carousel, something disappeared on a small viewport. And that's actually the default behavior in carousels is that these captions, it hides them on small viewport, right? So this is actually something that we haven't changed yet. So in carousels, we do want to make sure that these captions do not get removed, and they do that by default with these 2 classes. So this means display none, and then from the medium breakpoint and onwards, they make it display block again. That's how they hide it. So on smaller than medium, it's hidden. So we just want to remove this so that it's never hidden. Now the captions always stay here, right? So when you use captions, that's a tricky one, right? But now we also have a very nice modal, and we'll practice more with the grid system in a second. Now about responsiveness, by the way, in Bootstrap, I told you that it has a mobile first philosophy, right? So initially the default layout is that it's stacked, and then we can define a breakpoint at which point it should be changed, right? That's how we did it here. And that's how it always works with Bootstrap. So you can use this infix in the classes. In most classes, we also use it here, for example, navbar expand small, right? So you can use it in many classes, but this always means from that breakpoint onwards and bigger, right? So it starts off from the mobile first approach, and then you can do something when it gets bigger and bigger. Now, does that mean that you have to develop your website from a mobile first perspective as well? Like, do you need to do mobile first or desktop first? Well, I always do desktop first. So even when I use Bootstrap, I would use desktop first, right? Because that's what I prefer in many ways. I'm more of a desktop user myself. I'm not a very heavy mobile user, so I tend to prefer developing websites from the desktop first approach. However, it does depend a little bit on your team, on the type of project that you're creating. But simply because Bootstrap has a mobile first philosophy does not mean that you have to create your Bootstrap websites from a mobile first approach. So that's just a side note. Okay, so let's continue with the next section. That's going to be this overview section. And in here, we're actually using icons. So there are also so-called Bootstrap icons. You don't have to use them in your Bootstrap project, but they tend to work well with Bootstrap. So here at the end, they show you how to include it. I will use a CDN link again. You can also just use the SVGs, but we'll use the classes. I'll just include that here. Right, so you do need to include this separately. And then here after the carousel, let's see, we're going to have this overview section. So let's see, this is going to be just a section. We actually also have the section tag in HTML. Technically, we could actually make this a section as well for the carousel, as well as for the modal. Semantically, that would be better, I think. Right, so then here we would have the overview section. So I'll just use a custom class, right? So I would say overview. You could also signal that this is your own class, like C custom. I actually also used it for the carousel, but that was for carousel. C stood for carousel. But you could sort of prefix your custom classes so that you can easily distinguish between your own classes and Bootstrap's classes. So here we have an overview, and we're gonna have well, 3 parts. I'm just gonna use a div for each part. So we're gonna have an icon, and then we're gonna have some text. So I'll just write down the text first. 3 amazing destinations. And here I actually capitalized it in the HTML here, but you know, technically it's better to do this with CSS. You want to separate the styling from the HTML. Okay, so we have 3 parts and we have just the text. So now we want to add an icon to each part. So you can, right, so let's say we want this plain. You go to Bootstrap Icons and you can just, scroll through it, or at the top you can search for, let's say, plane. Let's say we want airplane fill. You can go here and now you can use that element because we already included it here, but you can also use the SVG. The SVG is just using path, right? So it's instructing the browser how to draw this image, right? But I'm using this here, and then I'll use the other ones as well. Right, so now I have included the other icons as well. So now this is what we get. So let's add some background color for this section, and also get that layout. So this section, now we need to give it some custom styles again. We have given it a class of overview, 180 pixels tall, and we'll give it a background color. And then this is what we get. So here we're actually just going to use some flexbox to get this layout that we want, right? So again, really want to stress that it's important that you have mastered the underlying fundamentals, especially flexbox, because that's what you need in the vast majority of layout issues. So here, if we want to have everything sit on the same line like this, it's very easy to use flexbox actually. You could also use the grid system, by the way, and we'll use that here as well. But with Flexbox, it's just very easy to get everything laid out like this. So what we can do is we could simply say dflex, and then everything sits on the same line. And then we want to make everything sit vertically centered. So there's another utility class based on Flexbox, is align items center. And then everything is vertically centered. Okay, now one other problem here is that they're sitting right against the edge, right? We don't want that, so we can use one of those container classes again. Now this overview section should span the entire width, right? So we're gonna add the container class in here because we want to constrain the width of the content in there, not of the overall overview class section, because we want to get that background color all the way to the edge, right? So that will add some space here. Now, when we do that, we do need to copy these classes to the other element now, because with Flexbox, it's always about a parent element and its child elements, right? But now we added an element in between the overview and a div, right? So now this should be the element that gets those classes, okay? So they are sitting on the same line, but we don't get that vertical centering anymore because this container does not have the entire width, or sorry, height of this overview section. So one other class we have to add here is H100, so it will take up 100% of the parent element, and then they will be centered vertically again. Okay, so now what we want to do, we want to get them in this particular layout, right? So there should be some space between them, but also on certain viewports, they should become stacked, right? So where it's stacked, and then at a certain breakpoint, they should expand like this. This is very easy to do with the Bootstrap grid system. So here I would use the grid system. So here it always starts with a row. So we'll do the row here. We have a row, and let's put all of these in the row. And then we have 12 units that we can allocate, right? So we can already use this div. So we have col, and we can give each one, let's say 4. Right, because we all want them to be equally big. So then they get 4 columns each. Now the row here, if you inspect this, it breaks here because the row is not taking up the entire width right now of the container. So we need to give the row a width of 100% as well. So we have a utility class for that as well. Right, so now we get that more balanced layout. We have 3 columns, right? But we want them to be centered in that column. So let's see, we can just say text center, and it will be inherited by all of that. We also want to increase the font size, so we can just set it as here, will be inherited, right? And now we also want to add some margin on the right side of the icon because it's sitting too close, right? So there's not a right side, but we have start and end. So we can go to the icons and we can say margin end. Now, when you give everything an equal size, so we have 12 units, right? And we give each one 4. When you have an equal size, you don't need to specify the actual number, right? So if you just say col, it will automatically divide up the space equally like that. Now, what we want is of course that that the initial layout is stacked. Right now it will always stay like this, right, where it's like expanded and horizontal, but we only want that from a particular viewport and onward, right? So now we can use those breakpoints again. Maybe we only want that on XL and bigger, so you only have to add XL here. And now it will be stacked. That's the default layout. And only on XL and bigger will it become wide like that. Okay, so that's this section. I think we've done everything here. Looks like it. So let's continue with the next one. Okay, so next section, we'll do the other sections a bit quicker. So we have the packages section. So let's quickly code that up. Let's see. Section. And I'll give it an ID, by the way, because what we want is that when you click on this in the nav, that you actually go there. And this is just a feature that you get from the browser out of the box, right? So that's not Bootstrap, but you have to use the ID to do that. So we have the packages section here. And here we're going to use the cart component. This is a very common component that you want to use in Bootstrap. Same with the other components. It has a lot of different classes. So you're not going to be able to code this from scratch, I think. So better to just go to the examples and copy them. However, before we do that, let's think about the layout. Let's do the layout here first and the other things here. So let's actually start with the heading of this section. So we say it is an H2 and it says packages. Let's see, packages should sit in the center though. So we can say text center. Okay. And we want to give this whole section some margin or padding on the top. I'll say padding top of 5 so that it pushes itself down a little bit. And same goes for this heading. I want to add margin both on the top and bottom. So it's the y-axis. So that's my. So now it's sitting there. Okay, so then we get to the cart. So let's think about the layout here. We're going to use the grid system again. So let's actually look at the default layout. Is that it is stacked, right? So these carts are stacked now, and only from a particular breakpoint and onwards do they become that horizontal layout, right? So very easy to do with the grid system. You start off with a row, right? And then you have 12 units to allocate, and we want those units, columns to be equally wide, right? But only from a particular breakpoint and onwards. So what you can say, you don't have to specify the number, but we have 3 columns, so we're gonna have 4, and they're gonna be equally big. So we don't have to specify the number, only the breakpoint at which point they should become that horizontal layout. So here I just picked large, but we have 3 of them. Right, so now we can place the cards in here, and the cards will automatically take up the width of that column, right? So Bootstrap does not give these cards a set width. So it does not give these cards a width of, let's say, 100 pixels. It will make them 100% by default. However, here in the example, you know, they do want to give it a particular width just so they can show you how it looks like. So here they actually do it with the style attribute, right? So when you copy it from this example, make sure that you pay attention to that, because we actually don't want them to have a set width like that, right? They should simply take up the width of this column in which they are placed, which it actually will do by default, but you do need to make sure that you don't copy that style attribute. So I'm just going to copy my card from the example here because it already has the correct text and images and so on. Right, so now I've placed these cards in their respective columns, just 3. Right, and we'll see if this works. Okay, that's a little bit big, but it does work. However, right, it does work. They are stacked, right? They are stacked. And at the large breakpoint, they do become horizontal. However, they're sitting right against the edge of the viewport, right? So here we can use that container class again to restrain the width. So we can put that entire row in a container class, right? This is a very handy class that you get out of the box. Right, so now I've put everything in that container class, and now it has restrained that width, right? So now it doesn't sit right against the edge, right? So now as I make it smaller and smaller, you can see we have a very nice looking layout here. Let me actually make it bigger again. And also when I click on the button here in the card, it also opens up the modal, right? In order to do that, you do need to add those data attributes to the button, right? So for each button, you need to add that data attribute so that it knows which modal to open and what it needs to toggle, a modal, and which modal specifically. Okay, now when we click on this packages in the top part of the navbar, we should go to this section, right? The browser should scroll us there. So it's not doing that right now, so I will go back to the navbar. I will open it up. So here, packages. To do that, we need to add that here to the href. So we say packages, and this will actually be frequently asked questions. And then I will close it again. So now if I do this, we have a nice smooth scroll to that section. Okay, let me close this as well. I'll close it right here, and then we can continue with the one of the final sections here, the frequently asked questions with the accordion component. All right, let's continue with the final section here in the main, which is the frequently asked questions. It's very similar to the packages section. So we just have section here. I'll give it an ID so that we can scroll to it. And I'll give it a class with padding so that we don't have, so it's not sitting right against the edge of the previous section. So in here, we're going to have an H2 as well. It's going to say frequently asked questions. And it's also going to have margin on both top and bottom. So we have this, should be text in the center, of course. All right. And then we're going to have that accordion component in Bootstrap, right? So this is another complicated component that you probably should not be coding from scratch. So I would just go here, accordion, and I think it looks pretty cool, actually, very modern. And this is what I would copy. So I'm going to copy this and then just customize it. And actually, I'll just copy it from my example because it's very similar to what they show here. So I'll just paste it right here. And let's see what we get if we do that. So we have an accordion component here. They have an item in there, and then we have the header. So you have the button in the header. That's what you see here when it's not open, right? So how long are the trips? That's here in the accordion header. And then you have the actual body. That's how these items are structured. It has a header and then a body, right? And you can open them up like this. I think it looks great out of the box, so that's pretty cool, right? Now I did add a custom class myself. Let's see. Yeah, so I did add this class to restrain the width a little bit because by default it stretches the entire width, right? So you can see this is very long. So what we could also add here is a container. And actually let's do that just to restrain the width. So now I added a container. I put everything in a container. It's actually quite a lot of HTML. So let me close that for a second. Right, so now the container has restrained the width, but this is still quite wide. So now on this accordion, I'm also going to say the width here, we have seen 100%, but they also have 75% of the parent element, right? That's how width percentages work in CSS. It's always about the height or width of the parent element. So now I think this is a nicer width. You can see that it's also responsive out of the box. Okay, so one other thing, by the way, about these sections is that on very small viewports, small devices, this is a lot of vertical space, right? So here on the top as well. So let's say that here we have padding on the top, right? Maybe we don't want that on smaller devices, only when it has reached a particular width and bigger. So what we can say here, you can also do that with padding. You can add those breakpoint suffixes. Oh, let me close this. So here we have the following, right? So we can say add padding on the top and bottom, but only when it has reached the medium breakpoint and bigger. So now you can see on smaller devices, it's a little bit more suitable, I think. It looks a little bit better. And then on wider viewport, yeah, so here on wider viewport, we get more padding, right? A little bit subtle perhaps, but I want to show you that you can also use these things, MD on padding and margin and so on. Right, I'll add it here for the packages as well, right? And then here, can we use this? Yeah, it works. But this is simply a browser feature. Okay, so we get to the end. Bootstrap does not have an out-of-the-box footer, and we could code the footer here step by step, but I don't want to bore you with a footer, so I'll just copy and paste it here, and I'll show you what I did. So I'll paste it here. So now we have this footer. So this footer is just using a bunch of utility classes, actually. So we have Aurora Tours. We have the display class. If you want like big text, you have display margin on the bottom. We have a copyright statement. It's using text white 50. This means white text, but with 50% opacity. So it looks a little bit darker. I think it looks a little bit better. It's using the container class. Actually not necessary, I think, because, well, it's not taking up much width, so it won't sit against the edge of the viewport anytime soon. But sometimes I just add it for any section, and maybe later on I decide to change the width of this. Maybe they should get a horizontal layout, for example, so it doesn't hurt to have it. The text light, text center, these are all utility classes, all very straightforward. Background dark, padding on top and bottom, margin on top and on the top as well. But we've seen all of that before, right? So this was an example of how you can quickly code up a complete page with Bootstrap. It's using the modern Bootstrap components. I think they look great. These cards look great, the buttons look great, Modal is very smooth. Bootstrap has really nice modern design these days, and it's a great option if you quickly want to code up like a prototype website before you spend more resources on it. You can quickly code up any type of idea that you have. And beyond that, these days, what you can also do is if these components from Bootstrap itself are not enough, there are third-party UI kits. So there are third-party UI kits. They have so many components, so many extra features. So you can really create complete websites by using the Bootstrap grid system, their whole philosophy. And those components, you can get them from somewhere else, right? So you can make really sophisticated modern websites these days with Bootstrap and its ecosystem. So it's a very powerful tool in your toolbox as a web developer. However, I do want to stress that it's important that you know the underlying fundamentals as well, because there's no way around them. You're going to have some custom styles sometimes. So make sure that you understand HTML, CSS, and also JavaScript itself very well. I have courses on them, check them out, the link is in the description. By the way, if this was helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Also, check out my courses on CSS and JavaScript if you want to take those skills to an advanced level. Because in there, we will build some beautiful real-world projects from scratch, so you can see how everything fits together and really master CSS or JavaScript. And I will also release other courses soon, like React and Node.js. So if you want to be notified, then make sure you are subscribed to the email newsletter. You can find the link in the description. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon.